Computer services. Okay. So, yes, welcome everybody again. And I'm Penelope, obviously, and I'm going to outline to you my research on the origins of the Alexander technique. And just to flash up right from the start, I'm launching a full course on this, which will launch on the 7th of April. It's an 8-module course that will run until July. So I'll talk more about that at the end. So if you have to drop out early for any reason, do flip to the end to find out what it was, what else you can discover. Everybody will get the recording, by the way. I'll be sending out the recording of this meeting later. So again, if you do have to leave for any reason, you can catch up the rest later. Hi, Sheila. Good to see you. Camera on. And Nicola. Hello. Good morning. So, yes, I'm presuming that everybody has read the first chapter of Use of the Self, called Evolution of a Technique. It's where Alexander tells the story of how he developed the technique. And it's a very compelling story. It's neat, it's inspiring, it's easy to summarize for pupils and publicity. It's been a great inspiration and marketing tool also for us for many years. But how factual is it? Because there are more facts around now that don't square. So I tried to answer this first in my book, which probably many of you here know, that was published 4 years ago now. At the beginning of chapter 7, I gave a little summary of a new model of how Alexander had developed the technique. But it wasn't, unfortunately, it wasn't fully accurate. I had written it some years before the book went to publishing. And as we got closer to publishing, I realized that there were inaccuracies there, and really it needed more research. But I had to prioritize whether to get the science top notch or whether to get the history top notch. And I chose the science at that moment, thinking I'd have time once the book went to the publisher to do the research. But actually, that's when COVID broke, and I was plunged into online teaching, teaching teachers to work online, as many of you know. So embarrassingly, it had to go to press with what I knew were errors, but I didn't really know what the errors were, and which was difficult. And so, not surprisingly, a year later, I had two attacks from two senior Alexander teachers saying, "You got this wrong." And I thought, okay, time to actually knuckle down and do the research on this. And one of them was really a balanced attack that just said this, and this, which is fine. And the other was a bit more nasty, but that's life. So I thought, time to do this research. And I thought a few months of research would do it. And then I do a little document, upgrade everything, and that would be the end of it. In fact, the more I researched, the more questions emerged, and it turned out to be a much longer process. And 3 years later, here we are, and really a new story has emerged, which is just, I think, fascinating. And that's what I want now to share with people. And I started to get answers to the conundrums that really, if you compare Use of the Self and what we now know, there are a number of quite serious paradoxes, unanswered questions, and blanks to be filled in. And so the new story is based mostly on facts, but there are gaps, and there we have to guess. So inevitably, there's a certain amount of speculation. I've done my best to come up with a complete, a unified story, but there's probably other versions. So I invite you to listen to the facts, listen to my speculations, and also make your own decisions. And those of you who come on the full course will have the full wealth of information with which to do that. So let's define the problem. There are several key inconsistencies between Use of the Self and our currently known facts. And the first is that we now know that Alexander originally taught breathing and elocution work, but this is simply not mentioned in Use of the Self. If you check every mention of the word breathing in that account, and in fact the whole book, it's only ever mentioned as the problem. It isn't mentioned at all as part of the solution. And we also know that he studied and even taught the Delsarte system early on, but this is also not mentioned. It's his Sydney business card, around about 1900, that offers, along with breathing and voice work, the famous Delsarte system as applied to dramatic expression, deportment, gesture, and vocalization. Gianni Masuero, who I studied with about 8 years ago now, certainly at that point, and I don't know whether to what extent he still does, but at that point he felt that FM's work was really Delsarte's work repackaged. Well, I don't think it's quite like that. I don't think it's that simple. FM was a genius, and he did have very much his own take on things, but all geniuses, all creatives, actually springboard their work from other people's ideas. And I think that's more generally accepted now. It suited him to say he did it all on his own, but we now know that wasn't really the case, and it's okay. So what can we learn by investigating the Delsarte methods? And then another conundrum, and I'd invite any of you who know, how long were you told when you were training, or when you first encountered the technique, how long were you told that it took to develop the Alexander work? I was told it took him 10 years. What were you told? Was anyone told different to that? 10 years, yeah, hold up fingers or put it 7 years. Right, there's a different answer. 10 years from somebody else. Any other volunteers on this one? Yeah, so there's a number of different takes on this out there. And I always presumed that he didn't begin teaching until that 10 years was up. Adrian also thinks 10. Yes, thank you. But we now know he was teaching within a year of his voice problems. And somehow it looked like Alexander work. So how does that work? What's going on here? And a little piece of evidence for what I just said is from a story that was told by Carrington, that in the 1940s, there was an elderly woman who came for a lesson to Ashley Place. It turned out she was visiting London, and she'd been one of the first people Alexander taught back in Auckland in 1895. And because she was in London, she sought out FM and took another lesson. And she went away smiling down the street, apparently. But Alexander then commented to Carrington, "Oh my goodness, what must I have been doing with my hands back then?" Which is very interesting. So he really was using his hands early on. And Marjorie Barlow also confirms that. But what was he doing? What was he teaching? And again, was he first a breathing man who then developed the Alexander technique as two distinct techniques? And that's rather what Jeroen Staring concludes in his monstrous book, monstrous in size. Or was he always teaching Alexander technique right from the start, but simply calling it breathing work because that was the hot topic of the day? And I understand that's what Carrington thought. Or is there a third possibility that what he was doing looked like Alexander technique, but actually in certain key ways was not? So let's hold that question open. Use of the Self was published in 1932, which coincided with the start of the first training course. So it very quickly became the manual of the course. Students were told, this is what you're trying to do. This is, and he said, you can do what I do if you do what I did, and gave that as the method to follow. But in many ways, it's not the method, it's the goal. It's what Alexander could do after 30, nearly 40 years of working on people. And I think there were multiple elements that didn't go into the use of the self account. And as we all know, the students really struggled to do what he did. And maybe that was because there were missing elements, that we weren't actually given the full story then. And so why didn't he tell us about these various elements? Probably because he, been there, done that. He moved on in his own thinking. He got that under his belt. He ceased to feel that bit was important anymore. He developed what he thought was a better way of working. He very much saw evolution as moving towards perfection, which they did in those days. Whereas nowadays we think of evolution as more adapting to the current situation. There's nothing intrinsically superior about the modern horse compared to the Paleolithic horse. They just are in different time zones, different states of the earth. And also, I do also slightly wonder if he, even suppressed some elements for reasons that, again, I'll outline later. We don't know. We don't know. We never will know. But what we do know is if we refine these missing bits, if we fill in the blanks, it actually can answer a lot of questions for us and aid us in our modern technique. So this isn't just an academic exercise to go back and look in detail at what he wrote and what he did. It really can help us to know what he did. If you do what I do, if you do what I did, you can do what I do. And I think we really do need all the steps to do that. And then we really can follow in his footsteps. It's not just that we, aren't trying hard enough. Yeah. Adrian has just commented, I was always under the impression that it was Dewey's influence that encouraged use of the self to be not historically accurate so that it read as a scientific treatise. I think there's something in that, Dewey. I think there really is. Adrian, I think that's another part of the picture of why he simplified it down to give a very clear step-by-step approach that then could justify the work scientifically. So that's another element. FM always told us, he always said, it's all in the books, which actually it isn't, but that's a story for another talk. The books were there, however, always in print in his lifetime, all 4 of them. But I think the problem became that because the people reading them had already started with the use of the self method, or read use of the self first, and the use of the self account was taken as a historically accurate document, because why wouldn't we assume that? Because FM was apparently a very honest man. That's one of the things people said about him. So if we then take use of the self as the starting point and try then to read Man's Supreme Inheritance and CCC, Constructive Conscious Control, and also the early articles, we'll be reading them with that as our starting point. And then it makes those earlier books actually very hard to understand. And I think we can read into them things that aren't there. And I think that's happened. So what I want to do, what I have done, is started from another perspective. Let's go right back to the beginning, start right at the beginning, forget use of the self, forget what we know, read it from scratch, and then a very different picture emerges that gives us ground floor up experiences of actually the path he followed, and it starts to make more sense, at least to me anyway. Alexander's books are full of guff. They are full of padding. As we all know, they're frustrating books to read. I go through them with a pencil, outlining the few words on each page that actually have any relevance and ignore the rest. But there's actually a lot of instruction in there if you know where to look and how to look for it. So let's start at the very beginning, because with a bland statement, the Alexander technique has its origins at FM's birth. Now, we all know, the story is told, that he was born premature and probably 34, 35, 36 weeks. It's amazing that he survived at that time. And we know it was only because of the dedication of his mother that he actually came through. Preterm babies struggle to breathe. their lungs are not yet fully developed. They don't have enough air sacs. The membranes are too thick. They don't have the elasticity. There's all sorts of reasons why the preterm baby's lung is not yet ready to encounter planet Earth atmosphere. And so every breath is hard work. It's actually a life or death struggle to get air in. So they develop strategies to help themselves. They often grunt at the end of the out-breath to stop the air sacs collapsing, and that depresses the larynx. And then they have to pull in like fury to get air in on the in-breath. And that means they flare their nostrils, they pull up their chest, they pull back their heads, they tighten their shoulders, they tighten and pull up everything. And FM was almost certainly doing that. If he was born that early, he would have been doing that. He would never have experienced a normal breath. So let's actually try that for a minute. Just let's be preterm babies. I want you to grunt hard on the out-breath. Push the air out, and then pull air in like fury through your nose, because tiny babies can't mouth breathe. Grunt, pull in, grunt, pull in, grunt, pull in, grunt, pull in. Apart from the fact it's knackering, if you have to do this every breath, what are you aware of? Is your diaphragm working? Would anyone like to feedback? God, I've gone dizzy. Anyone like to feedback on what you observe? Don't all sit there being polite. Come on, talk.
I mean, it's interesting, even for me, like you mentioned, I was not as aware of my diaphragm moving a lot. It was probably moving much less than it normally does, or perhaps not much at all. But there was so much more, I guess, muscular effort for me. It was really interesting.
Thank you. Lovely. Irmgard,
It's surprisingly loud.
loud. Yes.
Yes. I mean, to have that noise the whole time.
Yes. 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 Absolutely. Attila, did you want to add anything?
Sorry, I just needed my charger, but I did notice dizziness. That was the first sign. Like I'm losing my connection to the space around me.
Yes. Yes. Losing the connection to the space, I'm sure is true. We don't need to breathe that hard. That's why we go dizzy. But yes, losing the connection, I'm sure. Alexei.
Yeah, it's dizziness, of course. It's like, but then I understood that I had to use my like this abdominal wall muscles.
All right.
Like
Okay.
they started a little like a little pain, a little tension and pain, because usually it's like I don't feel it. Yeah, it's kind
Yeah.
of you had to do it.
You certainly have to do it, don't you? Yes. Fiona, I see your camera's off. Do you want to say something? Your microphone is on. Sorry.
Oh yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
It's just a sense of panic, just a sense of panic that would be involved in that breath and that breathing, and then just that fight or flight. It's very life or death kind of like, yeah, panic.
Absolutely. Thank you for mentioning that. Yes, absolutely. This is what you see in babies born between 34 and 7 weeks. And everyone was aware of tightening their neck in this. And so you're pulling your head back. And if somebody then tries to push milk down your throat, you will gag. And tiny babies got vomit. And that often apparently is why they don't survive, is because they're so busy fighting to breathe that they actually can't feed. And I got all this information from Jennifer Kello, who is an Alexander teacher who actually is a preterm baby nurse. And she observed these patterns in her little patients and realized this is what FM must have gone through, because all the facts fit. He couldn't hold milk down. He had breathing attacks as a child. And indeed, he had breathing attacks all his life, even though presumably they were more under control later on. And what Kello believes is that having discovered how to breathe this way, it allowed them to survive. Then many preterm babies keep this pattern into adulthood because they've never experienced a normal breath. And she's interviewed preterm babies who are now adults, and they've said, every breath is hard work, and I just never feel I can relax around breathing, and there's still that panic around it. So We'll go into FM's childhood in much more detail on the new course, and anyone who joins the course will also have access to Jennifer's paper. She's kindly given me permission to share it. FM was then a sickly child, not surprisingly. Breathing attacks his whole life. That's something I have heard. I mean, certainly he writes about it in his own autobiography that he had breathing attacks in adulthood. I'll talk more about it before he sorted things, but I understand they carried on. I can't remember now. I can't tell you now where I got that from. I'll have to look it up and let you know. So he was a sickly child, and I think he didn't go to school, but to start with, and then round about the age of 8, apparently his health recovered, and that also fits because that is the age at which the preterm baby's lungs finally catch up. And he then was engaged in the Tasmanian child's very outdoor life, riding horses, training horses, swimming, bushwalking, doing all sorts of outdoory fitness things, probably helping with the harvest. But he particularly loved the riding and the training horses. And one can assume, because he was still a delicate child, that he would not have had the strength to bully a horse to his will. He would have had to develop strategies to observe them, to talk to them, to calm them, to work with them, and to connect to them, and to direct their use even by his own thinking, by envisaging it first. And I'm not the only one to suggest that this is what he would have brought to his early work, probably totally unconsciously, that he had that in his background. When he was 16 or 17 in 1885, he moved to Waratah because he had to take his part in supporting the family, his eldest son, and he took clerical jobs. And in Waratah, he discovered acting. And he was there for, I think, 4 years. And he then moved to Melbourne in 1889 with the intent to get the advantage of the Melbourne theatre scene and to develop his acting. And there, he took clerical jobs to support himself. And I and others believe that this is when he first encountered and learnt the Delsart system, whether that was in Waratah as well, or whether it was just in Melbourne. And it's only speculation, we don't know, but it has to have been before everything else, because that's when he had the time. So what did he learn? And let's ask first, who was Delsart? So François Delsart was born in France in 1811 and died in 1871 when Alexander was only 2 years old, and he never left France. So Delsart was a singer who trained probably from around age 14 or something at the Paris Conservatoire, and he worked for some years as a singer afterwards, but he later lost his voice, and he blamed his training, the copy-me methods that were really only based on personal idiosyncrasy and had no scientific basis. And he realized this wasn't good enough, and he wanted to create a more scientific, more systematic method to train singers and actors. And he created the Delsart system of gestural training. Delsart he observed an awful lot of people, and he saw people had poor habits of movement, which restricted their ability to express themselves fully on stage if they were actors or singers. And he saw that these poor habits resulted from their over-involvement with their bodies. He said their minds are tangled in their bodies. And to come out of these habits, he realized you had to let go of the habits mentally. And then the joints freed, the muscle balance was restored, and movements coordinated. Sound familiar? So Delsart's goal was for the body to be a clear channel for gestural expression, so that the inner feeling could become a natural outer gesture. It was the first systematic way of training actors. There were many others that followed, of course, such as Chekhov and so on, but Delsart was the first, allowing for natural expression on stage rather than the formal stagey stuff. So Delsarte was hugely successful in France from around 1840 to 1860, something like that. And then he semi-retired, and an American called Steele MacKay was his last pupil. And he always said his best pupil as well. He trained with him in 1869, and MacKay then took Delsarte's work to America and launched it in 1871. And it was taken up straight away by the main acting schools, and it became the primary way of training actors for about 30 years. Popular books followed, aimed not only at actors but also at the general public. And Genevieve Stebbins' books was the first of these. I call them the Delsartean authors because they're following Delsarte, but how much it really, we don't really know how much Delsarte did, how much Steele MacKay added on. But again, I talk more about that on the course. So Delsarte work became the yoga or Pilates method of the day, with weekly classes for the ladies. And nice people did their Delsarte classes and got their deportment right. But that was all in the USA. And Alexander was in Australia. How could he have found out about this method? Well, Melbourne in the 1870s and onwards was a very wealthy city with a very thriving theatrical scene. And there were big promoters bringing in actors regularly from the UK and from the USA. And the Australians were already interested in more natural methods. They had no acting schools. And I believe that the books and methods of the Delsartean authors would have found their way across through visiting actors, probably. I have no evidence of this, except that Delsarte knew it. Alexander knew it, and he taught it, and he advertised he taught it, which suggests that it was out there and it was known and people were wanting to know about it. So let's do the very first exercise. That is in all of Delsartean textbooks, all the Delsartean books which that have methods in them. And it's called decomposition and recomposition, which are very strange names. You decompose yourself and then you recompose yourself again. So let's stand up and have a play. So muscles are activated according to the Delsarteans, and indeed at the time when the nerve force energy flows through them. So that's how they thought about the nerves in those days. But what Delsarte saw is that if the mind is over-involved in the body, then there are poor movement habits that create muscular imbalance. So to clear the mind from tangling in the body, we need to withdraw that nerve force energy back to the brain. He says back, as Stebbins says, back to the base of the brain, and others say right to the center of the body. And then we can flow the energy back through again, through these cleared channels, and then we can recruit a different and more harmonious balance of muscles. So if you put your arm out to the side, and I want you to just compare putting your fingers down and up again, down and up again. That's a doing action. And this time I want you to think of withdrawing the energy back. And you'll find that if you withdraw the energy back, the fingers will just fall and then flow them out again. And again, withdraw the energy back, and now withdraw the energy back to the wrist. And your hand has become a dead thing. You can just flop it around. You can flow it back through, and the fingers are now dead, but the palm is alive, and my thumb is dead as well. And so I'm going to again withdraw energy back to the wrist and just play around with that for a moment. And then we'll carry on with the sequence, flowing it back to the elbow. Your arm actually has to change orientation for that one. And now the whole lower arm is a dead thing, but the upper arm is still alive. And now we're going to flow the energy back to the shoulder, withdraw it back, and the whole arm is now floppy. And we can even withdraw it from the shoulder back to the center of the body. And now the whole arm, shoulder, is just a dead floppy thing. Okay, now we've cleared the channels, brought the mind back out of it. Now we're going to flow it back through again. So flow it into the shoulder and feel that wake up again. Flow it into the upper arm, but only as far as the elbow. The lower arm is still decomposed. Now flow it into the wrist. Just let that energy flow so that the arm reorients and comes up, but the hand is still floppy. Flow it through now to the knuckles. The fingers are still floppy. Flow it through right to the fingertips. Just do it one more time because it takes a bit to get the sense of this. And to decompose the fingers without the hand is something most people are unfamiliar with. Just decomposing back to the knuckles. They're dead. Decomposing back to the wrist. Withdrawing it back to the elbow. Withdrawing it back to the shoulder. Withdrawing it right back to the center of the body. The whole thing is just a dead thing. Blowing it back through to the shoulder. Blowing it back through to the elbow, leaving the lower arm alone. See how easy it is for one bit to get involved with another bit. We're really isolating the different joints here. Blow it through to the wrist. Blow it through to the knuckles. Blow it through right to the fingertips and the thumb as well. And then just take that hand for a little walk around, a little dance around in the air. Maybe pick something up and just be aware of the different quality of that hand. Now you have decomposed and recomposed. What's it like? Let's do it now with the other hand. So again, stick it out to the side. And again, let's just play. Just fold the hand and unfold it first, just to feel what doing it is. And then withdraw the energy. Notice the difference. And check that those fingers are now, they're now lifeless. Oh, I haven't withdrawn it from my thumb. Let that go as well. And now the whole hand. And the whole thing is now just a floppy thing. Withdraw it back to the elbow. Check that is now decomposed. Flow it back to the shoulder. The whole arm is now gone. And flow it right through to the center of the body. Even the shoulder itself is now decomposed. Flow it back through into the shoulder, into the elbow, one bit at a time, into the wrist. Still the hand is doing nothing. Flow it through to the knuckles, and then right the way through, fingers and thumbs. And again, take that hand for a little dance and pick something up. And now if you do a gesture with both those hands, what's it like compared to what you might have done earlier? So would anyone like to comment what that's like?
I'd say because of my work, so basically my usual position of fingers on right hand is like this. I can't, for me, very hard to relax it. And it's just, so to make my hand like this, I need it's work. I have to tense. And now it's just like, it's amazing. It's just like, because I don't feel it on the left because it's not that, but on the right is, I just feel, because for me it's like really like, I had to work hard to relax it.
That's amazing. I mean,
This
so
was just like, boom.
yeah,
That's
it's really
absolutely crazy.
brilliant. That's fantastic. Anyone else want to comment? What's your arms like? Irmad?
It was lighter somehow.
Lighter. Yes,
Yeah.
isn't it? Yes. Yes. When the muscles, when the balance between the flexors and extensors comes back into play, which is I think what we're doing. And I think that somewhere some of the Delsartians comment on that. Yeah, the whole thing lightens up.
Actually, when I put the glasses on, it really surprised me. It went whoop.
Lovely. Madeline.
I find it to be energizing and unifying. So recollecting the parts into the whole. Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes. It's very integrating, isn't it? This paradox that in order to integrate, you have to separate, you have to isolate, and then it integrates. Yes. Anyone else want to comment on it?
It was delightful.
Delightful. Yes.
Delightful. Yes. There was delight from my fingertips right through to, yeah.
Lovely. And delight includes the word light in it, doesn't it? Yes. Thank you, Aziz. Yeah. So there is evidence in Alexander's writings. There's a point where he talks about, there's various points where he talks about energy between the brain and the mechanisms, and other points where he talks about cutting that energy. And I'm beginning to think actually it's also the basis of inhibition work, table work. I think, we really do have the basis of inhibition and direction here. And when they first were doing table work, they called it inhibition work. And what are we doing for pupils but inviting them to, withdraw the life force and send it back again. So, yeah, and there's lots more Delsartean work to come. I think he had a very good foundation in Delsarte work before his voice problems. And it would have given him this knowledge that all poor habits have their roots in the mind. And I don't find anyone else who was saying that at that time. Not that I've done a full historical research across the field on that, but I don't see anyone else doing that. And that you need to let go of these mentally to allow something different to happen. And that this can feel wrong. That's in the Delsarteans as well. They notice that when these new habits come in, they feel wrong. Delsarte work would have developed his body mapping. What we've just done really teaches you where your joints are and in what planes your joints move. And that gives, again, awareness and freedom to convey emotions and meaning with the body. Delsarte work would also have given him knowledge of oppositions. This is stuff we will cover on the course. And taught him early forms of procedures, coming on toes, sitting and standing, tilting forward and back in a chair, taking a step, walking with harmonic poise. That's the Delsartean phrase, harmonic poise. He, I think, renamed it mechanical advantage, but it's quite clearly the same concept. So on the course, we'll investigate each of these theories and each of these methods, and we'll compare his work with the Delsartean methods, and you can make your own mind up whether Alexander drew on them or not. Because also, he might just have taken the starting point and then developed his work in parallel, because that can happen too. We'll never know, but there are an amazing number of parallels when you start looking. So in Melbourne, FM spent his evenings, his days in the clerical work, and his evenings were spent training in the acting, doing voice work, voice exercises, and performing whenever he could. Apparently he was also directing plays, and apparently he got rather good. He started winning competitions after a few years, and that is when he decided to turn professional. And so he increased his time spent on his vocal exercises and his training, and that's when his voice gave out. So his poor health had continued, breathing attacks, and also lowered vitality. He very much talks about that in his little autobiography, which wasn't written until 1950, say, around about 1950, but it very much mentions that. He'd had sympathetic bosses who let him take work home and do it in his own time. And at one point, he had a very much more serious attack that meant his doctor sent him to the seaside for 3 months to get him out of the polluted and overcrowded Melbourne, because TB, the top killers of the time, weren't heart disease and cancer in those days. They were tuberculosis and bronchitis. It was the respiratory diseases that were the top killers, probably a lot to do with the pollution. And that was so well in all developed cities. When he came back from the seaside, his old lodgings had gone, and he went to live with his voice coach, Fred Hill. And Fred's father had been T.E. Hill, the famous author of the book on oratory of the day in Australia. And it's been speculated that Fred Hill would have inherited his father's library. And the voice problems occurred while he was living with Fred Hill. So we don't know how much he discussed solutions with Fred Hill, but presumably when he turns to books, they were actually all there on Fred's shelves, perhaps. Maybe that's why he had ready access to the books that he mentioned in his first articles, which are Hartley, Natural Elocution, Brown and Benke's book, Voice, Song and Speech, a practical guide for singers and speakers, which was a very well-regarded work of the day, and Leo Koffler's book, The Art of Breathing as the Basis of Tone Production. We know he read these, as I say, because he quotes from them in his early articles. Now, all three of these books state very, very clearly that if you have voice problems, you cannot start with the voice. You have to sort your breathing first. And FM, who had had breathing problems since birth, must have realized the truth of this for himself. Brown and Benke's and Koffler's books both provided clear methodology to find whole body breathing to support the voice that was based on science and anatomy, not on poorly understood hand-me-down ideas such as were taught by most voice instructors. They were very much trying to put the whole thing on a scientific footing. And I speculate that this is where FM started, coming out of this clavicular breathing that he'd done from birth that we explored earlier, and first exploring abdominal breathing and then full chest breathing. And how did he do this? Well, FM later in 1906 wrote that while most authors focus on the in-breath, maximizing taking more air in, he focused on the out-breath. Now, Koffler and Brown and Benke both discuss the importance of the out-breath, but I feel that neither of them discovered how to carry this plan fully through as FM did. If anyone's got the book Aphorisms, anyone got that little book? That one of the aphorisms, page 60, is, if I don't breathe, I breathe. So that was around. It didn't come through to us on our training, but maybe it came down to some people. But he explains it more clearly in a 1908 article. If you want to tell somebody how to breathe, then tell him not to breathe. In other words, get him out of his habits, and then the right thing will do itself, as it were. And then years later, again in, I suppose in the 1940s, he would tell Frank Pierce Jones of how he learnt to use his hands in a different way in teaching by applying the inhibitory control which had proved so effective in breathing and speaking. And that's on page 31, if anyone wants to check that one out. So by applying the inhibitory control which had proved so effective in breathing and speaking. So it would seem that the key to his unique method was inhibition. So no surprises there, but it's not inhibition of the neck. It's inhibition of the in-breath, waiting at the end of the out-breath, inhibiting the habitual in-breath, and also giving space for the body's organizational systems, as I would call them, to take over and organize a spontaneous, natural, full in-breath. So he writes in 1906, I do not claim to have discovered any new method of breathing, but to understand the only true one, nature's. So right from the start, he is using undoing rather than doing as the cornerstone of his method. And isn't that amazing that he somehow was onto that straight away? So let's all lie down, and while you're sorting yourself somewhere to lie down, I will just talk to you about where he got his method from. So if everyone would like to start finding themselves yoga mat or something on the floor, a nice piece of carpet, you can put books under your head if you want, and really make yourself comfortable. Because while Koffler and Brown and Benke discuss the importance of the out-breath, they don't describe using it to find the in-breath, as Alexander does. I can only find two other teachers of the time who did that. using the long out breath as a method for allowing the spontaneous in-breath, as Carl Stow would later discover as well, quite independently. Many of you will have taken Jessica Wolf's work. Both the authors I found, although they're too late for FM to have picked up on, their methods may have been available to him, because one of them, Emily Bishop, is a Delsartian, and it's possible that this exercise was in their methods that FM learnt, and the other is Benke's daughter. And we know FM read Benke's books, so it is possible that the father used these methods out also, and that they may simply have been around. Either way, whether he discovered it himself or used someone else's exercise as a springboard for his own work, he made this non-doing approach the cornerstone of his technique and developed it. Stop doing the wrong thing and the right thing will do itself. Whereas all the other authors, actually, the minute this finding the breath has happened, they've gone back to using more doing techniques. So we're going to inhibit the in-breath. So let's use the Delsart decomposition, because after all, if you are, just put a hand on your chest for a moment and check out whether you do any lifting of the chest. But remember, if you were FM, that's what you'd be doing. So just do that for a moment and just feel how this area is over-energized. Let's just get rid of that. And now I want you to withdraw all the energy from your chest back to, I suggest at this point that we use the brainstem, but you could also use the center of the body as where to withdraw it back to. So draw the energy out of your clavicles. Just draw the energy out of your clavicles. Draw the energy out of your ribs, out of your intercostals. Withdraw the energy out of your chest. Take that energy back to the base of the brain, and then let that out breath be full, and then just wait. And wait. You're just resting there. You're not holding. You're just resting there. And at some point, the body will organize the in-breath for you, and you're just waiting. You're just staying out of the way. And the in-breath will happen. Come back once you've done that in-breath, again to withdrawing the energy. Withdraw it from your clavicles, from your ribs, from your chest, from your shoulder blades, from your shoulders, from your neck. Just withdraw the energy. And even if you overuse your abdomen, withdraw it from your abdomen too. And then just wait. And just notice the in-breath that happens, that then happens. Is it easier? Is it spontaneous? And does it then involve the diaphragm, the intercostals, down here, the floating ribs, the lower ribs? One more time, just withdraw that energy from the chest. Withdraw it from the face as well. Maybe if you're overworking your face as you're breathing, withdraw it from your face, from your head, from your neck, from your ribs, from your shoulders. And just wait until something flowers from deep inside you. And then the body is allowed, the spinal cord, the brainstem, the deep unconscious parts of the central nervous system can recruit the muscles that we need. Recruit the muscles it actually wants to be using rather than the ones that we somehow got involved in using. So, and this spontaneous in-breath, when it happens, that you really, in a sense, have no control of, it just takes you where it will, doesn't it? And he called that the primary movement. The primary movement that allows the thoracic mechanism. So, come back to standing, come back to our chairs. Let's tell me what you discovered. And on the course, we'll be exploring Alexander's full respiratory method and vocal method as it appears in the books. Adrian. Yeah, that's it. You're unmuted.
Oh, have you just put my microphone off? Sorry. I was looking for it on the app on my phone. I was getting butterfingers. You beat me to it, actually. I was about to ask you about primary movement. I saw a blog a few years back by Edgar Harvel about it, and I've been fascinated with it ever since.
Yes.
I think it was actually true primary movement.
Yes.
But you kind of beat me to it. But I've been employing this for a couple of years already, realizing how, particularly on the natural in-breath, it's not just the rib cage, the entire spine moves.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Which means if your spine moves in breathing, there can be no posture. It can't exist.
Yes, absolutely. Exactly. There is no difference between posture and movement. Everything is movement.
Exactly.
And
yeah, and I've been obsessed with that for a couple of years now since reading his blog.
Yeah.
And I'm much. I was actually going to type something to you, and then you said I wasn't lying on the floor, to be honest. I think it's a great shame he dropped the phrase, and it annoys me he did. And I assumed that maybe the reason he did was he was repackaging his work away from being known as the breathing man.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I'm trying to get the phrase back. I love true primary movement. What can be more primary than the movement of the torso and breath, including the spine?
Yes.
And if that's being interfered with, you know you have interfered.
Yes.
That's all we can know when we go wrong.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yes, I didn't actually do the lying down, I have to be honest. But yeah, I was just thinking about that phrase.
Yes. No, that's great. Thank you. Thank you for that feedback. Anyone else like to share how it was for them? Aziz.
Yes, breathing has concerned me for some time. And I've always wondered why it is that no matter what I did, it seemed to me like I was using too much effort.
Mm-hmm.
And this was the first time I experienced what it was like to breathe with so little effort. And you're right, it felt as if it was activating the front of my spine. It felt as if it was coming, that it had something to do with the front of my spine. Yeah.
Fantastic. Absolutely. And the front of the roots of the diaphragm, after all, go down the front of the spine. And yeah, brilliant. How beautiful. Thank you. What must it have been like for FM to experience a normal breath for the first time? Just, and Jennifer Keller says when she gets it happening in her little babies, she says she sees the surprise on their faces. Yes.
Can I say something?
Please, Senior.
Yeah. For me, this is also to do with the chemistry, because we have this effect called the Bernoulli effect that I am definitely not able to explain anything about. You can look it up, Bernoulli effect, and it's something that has to do with the body can on its own take breath in. It happens automatically due to some chemical exchanges after an exhale. And if you don't interfere with anything mechanically, mentally, or whatever, it happens.
Yes. Yes.
And it's also a question of chemistry, and I find that very fascinating.
Well, isn't it beautiful? Yes.
I think that's the reason we're actually able to go through a night's sleep. And well, we're still breathing, although we're sleeping.
Yes,
Due
it's
to
the phrenic nerve. My understanding is the phrenic nerve is sort of on the diaphragm, and it's actually picking up the carbon dioxide levels in the blood. And the more carbon dioxide builds up, the blood goes more acid, and there's a threshold It's not to do with oxygen, it's to do with carbon dioxide. When that threshold is reached, it then sends a message back to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus says yes, sends a message down, and it says to the diaphragm, contract and breathe in. And that's, so as you say, if what we're doing is getting out of the way and let a purely chemical process take over. Yeah, you're spot on there.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think it's so nice that this is how he discovered inhibition, because after all, any other form of inhibition, if I say no and then say yes to move, I have to do something. Whereas breathing, you don't have to do anything. The movement will do itself. And it's a wonderful way, really, to experience inhibition. Irmgard.
I found it a bit difficult because I find to not breathe, where it doesn't come naturally at all. And yeah, so then you on purpose don't breathe, which for me is a way of doing something, because normally I would breathe somehow.
Yes.
So where is the doing and where is the not doing? For me, not breathing in that case is actually a doing.
Yes.
Do you see?
I do actually. I've worked with pupils who are so determined to breathe in that they find it very, very hard to stay on the out breath. But if one just keeps having a go, it comes. And the other one I was aware of when I was first doing this, because my breathing patterns were all over the shop for many years when I first started doing this. So my abdominal muscles would just clench when I breathed out, and it became a stop. And as I've done it more and more, so my abdominal muscles have softened, and now I can just rest without things promptly gripping. So there's, we have a lot of interference patterns in our respiratory system. But I think if we're just very gentle with ourselves and just invite, for some pupils, even if they can rest at the bottom of the out breath for a fraction of a second, that allows something to begin to shift in the system. Obviously, I don't know more about you without working with you directly, but that's what I might suggest. Does that resonate at all, Irmgard?
Yes and no, because on one level it's also an intellectual problem I have there, because whoever talked just before me with the that is actually inbuilt would imply that there is a natural moment where you start to breathe in automatically. Now, if I did tell myself to wait within breathing in, well, if I'm so tuned into myself that I will know, okay, this is the moment when the natural in-breath will happen anyway, I don't need the exercise. Do you see what I mean? It's unlikely that I'm so tuned in.
Well, I think, yeah, it's it's paradoxical. To start with, I think we need to really work on getting the mind out of the way so that we can, and again, that's where the intellectual thing comes in. Can I get the mind out of the way? Maybe you can take your mind down to your feet if it's thinking too hard about it. Take the nerve force somewhere completely different. Just to let the body find its own way, but it can take a long time. When I was first doing this method, I could be lying still for maybe 45 minutes, an hour and a half, I think, once before I got the breath that actually was a normal breath. So for me, it took a lot of work to bring this pattern in. When I've worked with pupils, most people get it like that. But people with really skewed breathing patterns, it can take a long, long time. And the skewing can be, just musicians can take a long time to get it as well, because if they've been trained as a clarinetist, say, they've got very trained patterns around their breathing system, and singers likewise. It can take a lot to get out of the way. But this thing of, withdrawing the mind back somewhere else, withdrawing the nerve force, I think is really part of the key. Does that make sense? So play with it, see what you discover. Aziz.
Yeah, it's Aziza, by the way.
Thank you, Aziza. Yes.
There's 2 dots over the E. Yeah.
Oh, there are. Yes, thank you.
What I noticed, and I find this because early on when I was training to be a teacher, what I noticed a lot was that the breathing had something to do with what we did with our arms. And the first exercise that we did, withdrawing, the energy from the arms. And then the state that my arms, or my heightened awareness of what was going on with my arms, I found that when you were asking us to withdraw our energy, etc., that it automatically happened with the arms, and that made a big difference. That made a big difference because the arms can have so much to do with clenching our breathing. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, we really do need to make a separation between this is something Miss Goldie actually said to me when I did lessons with her, that I needed to make a separation between what was going on in the chest and what was going on in the shoulder girdle and the arms. And ideally, we should be able to breathe without any interference with the arms, and we also should be able to, do pull-ups and do what we like with our arms without interfering with the breathing. They are two separate. Again, we need to be able to isolate the two. Yeah, interesting. Thank you. Alexei, one more and then we'll carry on.
First is like if you think about true primary movement, that when you're born, basically breathing is the only movement that you can do. You can't do any other movement. It's just like the first. Because when child is born, it's basically so it's kind of in this way it very much makes sense.
Lovely. That's beautiful. That's a
I
lovely
never
thought.
thought about it, but it's
Yeah.
it's just absolutely aligning with this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes. So yeah, and I've used his methods for years for sorting my own breathing, and more recently through studying this more recently in the last 3 years. I've also used it to help recover my voice after a series of bad colds knocked it out. So, his methods work. They're brilliant. Worth knowing. And as I say, on the course, we'll go through his whole method. In 1906, in his discussion of reawakening the thoracic mechanism, FM refers to the primary movement, the true primary movement. Thank you, Adrian. It's also in other early articles in different contexts, and also in MSI, where he talks about the primary movement of walking. So there are different primary movements for different activities, it seems. But because Carrington's and others had read these works after reading Use of the Self, they assumed that it referred to primary control, the movement of the head leading forward and up off the neck. And they assumed that primary movement was simply the first phrase for primary control. But if you read the early articles as a starting point, then a different view is clear. The primary movement of the respiratory mechanism is the spontaneous movement of the in-breath that widens, deepens, and lifts the chest. So, does taking the head up feature at all? Well, yes, it does. In his early articles, FM writes that you need to take your head up because pulling the head back and down tightens the neck, which tightens the larynx, and will stop anybody from speaking and singing freely. It's all about keeping the larynx free. That's the point of the neck stuff. It's and all the good singing, breathing instructors at the time all tell you not to pull your head back, but to send it up instead. And when he gives a list of what you've got to do, don't pull the head back is not the one he italicizes. The one he italicizes is to do with the torso mechanism, not to do with taking the head up. He's not interested in the head at this time, except in how it can screw up the larynx. He's interested in the torso and the breathing mechanism. That is his primary discovery. In the 1940s, FM told Trevelyan, a man has not lived until he can widen his back. I mean, what a thing to say. What would you say? A man has not lived until. A man hasn't lived until he can widen his back. I mean, just what must that first breath have felt like to him? That to him, that was the restoring of life. So in his articles, he describes poor breathing as the cause of all health and posture problems. And it undoubtedly was for him. For him, breathing was the primary issue. So where on earth does the use of the self account fit? Well, Jean Fischer has pointed out that in the use of the self, it's the discovery of how to prevent the pulling back of his head, which decreased the hoarseness and allowed his larynx and vocal cords to improve. The discovery that the head goes forward and up comes much, much later. So his quote, this is in use of the self, this led me to a discovery which turned out to be of great importance, that when I succeeded in preventing the pulling back of the head, this tended indirectly to check the sucking in of breath and the depressing of the larynx. This marked the first important stage of my investigation. With the prevention of the misuse of these parts, I tended to become less hoarse while reciting, and that as I gradually gained experience in this prevention, my liability to hoarseness tended to decrease. What is more, when my throat was then examined by my medical friends, a considerable improvement was found in the general condition of my larynx and vocal cords. So I would suggest that this initial discovery was actually made through doing this breathing work, enough to mend his voice to act again and to go on his grand tour, first of Tasmania and then in New Zealand, and to begin working with others. And he was working within a few months of that first Tasmanian tour. Within a few months, he was working with people. And as he continued then to work on himself, and as he gained experience of working with pupils, the importance of the head-neck-back relationship, I think, would slowly have evolved from there. Breathing and voice were hot topics of the day. Voice problems were a major issue, and I speculate that that's because the population had grown, so that public buildings, the law courts, the churches, the concert halls, etc., had all got much bigger. Think of the difference between an 18th century church and a 19th century church, anyone who knows their churches. But of course, there were still no PA systems. So everybody was trying to be heard over these much bigger spaces, much, greater background noise. And then, as I say, also breathing problems were the number one killers, TB, bronchitis. There were poor darts, pollution, especially smoke from coal fires. And so, it was a natural place for him to start anyway, but it was his own concern as well. The first lessons he gave were to amateur actors, and they were for voice. They heard him recite in somewhere in Tasmania, I forget where, and said, we'd like to learn from you. So he said, okay, and that's where he began. And I believe in those early lessons, he was teaching people to breathe, because if their voice is gone, that's what the problem is. But as part of that, he had to get their bodies into awareness and life to free off the thoracic mechanism. Now, once I discovered these early articles, I thought, well, next pupil I have with voice, I'll have a go and just do these methods. And it didn't work because their bodies were too stiff. I had to work freeing them off first before we could get in there with the voice work, with this more fine breathing work. So I speculate that he was doing bits of Delsart with them, decomposing them and recomposing them, doing harmonic poise with them, standing, sitting, leaning forward. Maybe I suspect that in singing tradition, there's a certain amount of leaning forward, perhaps with your hand on a table to open the back. Who knows what else was going on? Maybe wall work was being done early on, certainly tilting backwards and forwards. He already had the observation skills, as we've said, through his work with horses, and then with his work with the Delsart. He already had the skill of calming. Carrington said that in the 1940s, they'd listen at the door of his teaching room, and he said he'd be talking absolute rubbish to the pupil, but it sounded like calming a horse. There, calm down. So he already knew how to do that, and he already knew how to use his intention, his voice. He had a sense of his body, and he could use that again to teach pupils to be more aware of their own bodies. So he had a whole raft of tools, if I'm right on this, which I don't know, but if I'm right, he had a whole raft of tools to bring to that early work, because it was obviously a success right from the start. And if he'd just done a few hours of work in front of the mirror, I don't see that he would have had those tools right that early on. So one can presume that most of his pupils would not have had all that background. Most of them would have sat in schools for 8 hours like we had to do, getting stiff and bored and tired and, in their heads and so on. So he began to use his hands instinctively to help them know where their bodies were and how to move them. Marjorie says, when they didn't understand, don't pull your head back, he took hold of their heads and said, you do that. And maybe he started to take hold of arms to free off their rib cage. Who knows? But so the Alexander work began. And so I wonder if he took the Delsartian procedures and turned them slowly into his own procedures, and probably developed, got things from other places. Who knows what he drew on and what he discovered himself. There are other physical games. The various voice teachers all give physical games to play to free off arms and legs and so on, but they are very physical. I don't see any parallel with these with Alexander. Likewise, it's been suggested that he drew on other physical therapists of the time, the Roths in London. But again, their methods are very doing. I can't find anything to parallel the non-doing and psychophysical aspects of the Delsart work. And so through the early articles between 1894 and 1903, one has the sense of Alexander finding his own voice. Initially, he uses other people's names and descriptions and lists, particularly Koffler. And by 1903, he's really making his techniques his own and beginning to make his own names for his work and find his own ways of describing them. And slowly, as he gained experience with his skill and his skill with his hands developed, doubtless he began to notice how the head influenced the rest of the body, eventually noticing that it moved forwards and up off the body, followed by a lengthening and widening. And I think that started to come together round about 1908, 1909, 1910, something like that. That started to come together. By 1910 and the first editions of Man's Supreme Inheritance, he had this new model of the body, the beginnings of the new model, which was led by the head rather than the breathing. But primary control was not developed until 1925. But breathing, even though it wasn't mentioned as a goal, as a method, as a part of the method, it still was. It still was a crucial part of the work because it's this that brings the widening. And it sorts the thoracic mechanism, without which the body will not come into mechanical advantage. The directions of primary control, I've been, again, reading and reading and rereading and rereading and rereading this early work. And what starts to stand out is that the directions of primary control, send your head forward and up, let your back lengthen and widen and so on, are the only ones that he trusts the pupil to do for themselves. When it comes to the widening, he says, I've got to do that for you. I've got to sort the thoracic mechanism for you. So he stopped, and he never gives the method again. He gives it 1906, but he never gives it again. And if you go back and read carefully where he has the pupil in CCC with their hands on the chair, you'll find he's telling them to do the primary control, but he adjusts the thoracic mechanism. He just stopped telling us how to do that. And the description of breathing in CCC, again, does not actually contain any real information other than don't do the wrong thing and the right thing will do itself. So why did he stop talking or writing about breathing so directly and so absolutely? Well, he'd moved to London in 1904, still teaching breathing and voice work, which again, I think surprised a lot of people when they discovered that. We assumed that he arrived in London teaching the Alexander work, but he didn't. He wrote several detailed articles describing his work. He became friends with Dr. Spicer, who was a renowned ear, nose, and throat surgeon who helped him build his practice and probably taught him a lot more about the physiology of breathing. In 1908, that's when FM's focus shifted. He wrote the article Re-Education of the Kinesthetic Systems, which was the first article that didn't mention breathing And I think it's here that the Alexander work, as we know it, begins. 14 years after its beginnings in Tasmania. The pupil rehearses and gives their orders while the teacher moves them. They cannot do it for themselves because they would rely on their sensations and they have faulty kinesthesia. The head going forward and up is first mentioned in 1911. In 1909, he takes this a step further. He makes the shift from breath as causative of all health and postural problems to physical coordination, one's use of the body, itself led by faulty thinking, as causative of all breathing and health problems. He's not shy of making grand claims. This shift may have occurred as he worked with more people, because breathing had been his own primary interference, from which he'd probably assumed that breathing was everybody's primary interference. But as he worked with people, he'd probably realized that for a lot of people, it's the faulty coordination of the body and the faulty thinking, which is their primary interference. And so he turned it on its head and get the thinking and the use of the body right, and the right breathing will right itself. And he states this clearly in 1909. But there was possibly another factor in this shift, because in 1909, Dr. Spicer, his friend supposedly, gave a lecture which FM saw as plagiarizing his own work. And this could have been disastrous for him, because he was, very undereducated. He was an unknown from the colonies, and he was up against an established doctor, a leader in his field. He wouldn't have stood a chance. He wrote a protest against Spicer, and Spicer responded with an article recommending that the principles he advocates should only be taught by qualified medical men and not be exploited by some irregular hypnotists, suggestion healers, physical and vocal trainers. Well, there's a sideswipe, if ever one saw one. So Alexander at this point really split with Spicer, and his promotion. Spicer promoted back breathing, and Alexander wrote, "I consider it dangerous to suggest to the pupil that the act of breathing is of primary importance and that he is to perform it with a particular part of the body. Given the perfect coordination of all the parts as acquired by my system, breathing is a subordinate operation which will perform itself." And from this moment, he never wrote about breathing directly again, or taught it either, as far as I'm aware. FM was always after nature's way, after wholeness, and he follows through on this quest. I consider that among all the authors and the methods around at the time, many of which claimed to re-establish natural states, and they claimed to re-establish natural movement in breathing and movement, FM had a deeper understanding of what was involved. He was the only one who stayed true to the principles that would truly achieve that, which are the undoing principles. All the others, they can't resist getting in there and doing something, and then, of course, they've squared their own purpose. But if we are to get through to this deep understanding Alexander had, we need to rediscover the path that he took and understand the early methods that brought us to this point. And this is what this course will give you, much deeper understanding of many aspects of your work. And here we have answers to the original conundrums. And so, questions. And by the way, I'll send you the link to the course afterwards. And anyone who books this weekend, it's 10% off if you book before midnight on Sunday. So for those who want to join. And I really hope that a lot of you do. So questions, comments, what do you feel? What's your response to all this rather new stuff that I'm chucking at you here? Because it's a lot to take in, isn't it? Adrian.
I'm using myself. Hi, so going back a bit to what you were talking about, withdrawing energy and putting it back. My thought at the time when you said that was the genesis for directing. You said inhibition. But there again, it's often said they're the flip side of the same coin. So
Yes, yes,
But
absolutely,
that,
isn't it? It's both inhibition and direction.
and I personally avoid the word direction. I think it's a term that doesn't seem to translate in modern parlance that well. I personally use, and did while I was doing the exercise, I use the word intention for myself.
Yeah, it's certainly part of it, isn't it? If you reach for a pen, you direct towards that pen, but it's your intent that actually reaches you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if how close the word intention overlays with the way Alexander would have used the word direction or directing.
Well,
The language has changed so much over the last 100 years. I mean, even the word thinking, I think, has changed its meaning. We tend to these days use it to mean linguistic, symbolic thoughts going on in our head. And that's not what he meant. I mean, did the word thinking mean more awareness and, presence in his day? I don't know.
I wonder that could well be the case. It's an interesting thought. I mean, how did he use direction? There's that little footnote in Use of the Self where he says, when I use the word directing in phrases such as I directed the use, I'm referring not just only for the messages between the brain and the mechanisms, and he means the mechanisms of movement, he never uses the word muscle, but also in conducting the energy necessary to the use of those mechanisms. So again, he's talking about conducting energy flow, which again is something that science doesn't like, but you can feel it, can't you? You can feel
But
that.
that's what intention is. What do you mean by energy flow? But we run on electricity at the end of the day.
Yes, and an intention flows the energy.
Yeah, I mean, energy is electricity, if you like. I mean, you can use the word energy quite literally there if you're talking about sodium ions going down nerve paths.
Absolutely, that's right. There really is energy flowing.
Yeah.
So it's not just and again,
But energy is a communication, though, as a communication rather than the activation kind of happens once communication's been given, in my thinking.
Yeah, but it's not just. I think what's interesting is that, again, I think one of the catches we've got in the modern technique is that people just lie in semi-supine and do think-throughs of directions, but they don't actually take it into movement. And Alexander and also the early teachers, as far as I'm aware, they saw that it's no good just thinking a direction. You actually have to activate it. You have to have an intent to move. You have to flow some energy. And I think we've got two non-doing in that sense. Fiona is asking, was FM influenced by Eastern religions like yoga? It's a very, very interesting one that we will never know the answer to. But somebody who went to Tasmania and did the whole, FM tour, as it were, got talking to somebody from the museum who is very much interested in FM. And they said that there were people around who were retired from India. And one was from a tea plantation and may well have stimulated his interest in tea because he loved his tea and was a bit of a tea guru. And the other was a man who went around lecturing on Indian religions and Indian philosophy. Now, FM would have been under 60, would have been 16 or less if he heard those talks. But who knows what was going on then and what was going on in Melbourne. I mean, we don't know. So I don't know that yoga was there, but there might have been stuff around. We just don't know. Thank you. Ben.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, interesting. Going back to what Adrian was saying and connecting with the energy, if we ground ourselves, we can feel that ground reaction force. And come on, but what I was going to say was a couple of points was that Francois Delsart's younger brother, Camille, actually emigrated to Hobart. So he was in Tasmania before Alexander was. And so there was a whole school of Delsartians going on there.
Well, I'm not sure that's true. I mean, I did try to follow up on that, and I wrote that one in my book. But there's no evidence that Camille Delsarte taught anything other than singing. There's actually no evidence that I know of that he actually taught his brother's methods. And again, Jandot suspected that his wife might have, who was from Hobart, might have had lessons as a child, but that doesn't either. The dates don't fit, and because he wondered if he got that link through his wife, but no, that doesn't add up. So
Perhaps to clear that up.
yeah, so I don't think that's the route. I think it's more likely to have come through the American books, because, as I say, they would have found their way. I think.
The question I got about you spoke about the your clenching of your ribs.
Yes.
And was that sort of connected to the overarching of your back?
Sorry, in my own connection, in Alexander's
in your own connection.
In my own use, I just held everything pretty still. I had chronic fatigue and everything was pretty frozen. Yes, the back would have been arched and the rib cage in the wrong alignment, and it was just about every misuse going. I was holding too long on the out breath, holding the in breath.
What I found fascinating historically, like reading about you and your work with Miss Goldie and Jandot, is that somehow you managed to experience something with Jandot which you'd experienced 40 years earlier with Goldie.
Yes.
Goldie was someone who was in a separate clique to the other 1932 training students, and she must have learned something different from Alexander to what the Carrington clique and the Trevelyan clique, they seem to have different kind of avenues that they explored.
It's an interesting one, that, isn't it? Yes. I mean, I think she was around him for longer. I mean, she joined in 1927. She was working with the small school. She would have had opportunities to work with him as an adult. And then, of course, she was very close to him. I mean, there was that whole "are they lovers" thing going on, which I don't think they were. He had a lover. It was Jack, and with whom he had the child. But so I think she just hero worshipped him, and he took it very nicely. Thank you. So she was totally dedicated. She also house kept him for him at the end of his life. I do wonder if she had conversations with him and drew stuff out of him that other people didn't. That's just a thought. Yeah, but she did seem to. My sense is that she had more of a sense of the earlier work for whatever reason. And again, maybe that's because she also did she would have done some of her early training with Miss Tasker. And Tasker, of course, was one of the very early people to join, along with Ethel Webb, and would have seen the earlier work. And there's that tantalizing sentence in Irene Tasker's talk, Connecting Links. Of course, back then he was teaching quite differently.
Yeah, and
he doesn't tell us.
No, Irene Tasker went on to teach Raymond Dodd, who developed the Dodd procedures as well.
Yes.
So it's interesting how that sort of avenue flowed through.
Yes, but there was much more going on with the torso, and Goldie very much was doing much more with the torso than I think the others were. And also, the other one that I've become aware of is that I think MacDonald and Carrington, for the best intentions to help their students, actually slightly watered things down to make it simpler, to make it easier to grasp, and so on. Goldie did not. You did it the hard way, or you didn't do it. So it was totally uncompromising. She insisted that every part of you was alive, every part of you was engaged. And that I think she would have got from FM. There was no watering it down. So yes, I think there's a whole package of things going on there.
Oh, thank you for your answers. Very much appreciated.
You're welcome. Attila.
So you mentioned at the beginning of this call that there are certain details in your books that that they are not completely accurate. So we've been using your book in our teacher training course. So can you point to specific parts which you wouldn't recommend using now as you see
I
things.
will send you a revised the part of chapter 7. I've got a revised version. I'll send it to you. And
Thank
any
you.
other training courses that want that again, please ask. Yes.
Thanks. Okay.
You're welcome. And also I've got a video course up on my website called Chapter 7 Explorations, and that also has got modified forms of the pulls for Chapter 7, because there's a lot more. When I was still really fairly near the beginning of investigating those stronger pulls when I wrote the book, and subsequently I've taken it a lot further, and I think it's more of a whole body. I think I've blended the pure Miss Goldie thinking, the discovery process, the breathing work, and the pulls together much more now. Whereas when I wrote the book, they were all still a little bit, how do I link this up? I could have done with another 10 years before the book was published, but hey, you, you can wait
Okay.
forever.
Thank you so much.
Yes, you're welcome. Madeline.
I just want to share a little feedback of how I've appreciated this talk being about broadening our understanding beyond the books and beyond what perhaps we've learned in our different streams of training course, and to look at the bigger picture of the whole human experience of his experience from being born to his struggles later on. And just that I really appreciate that as teachers, we continue to have that level of openness and not to stay confined to paths of what we're learning through the vines of our own training. And just to keep that exploration going. So thank you very much for this. Very broadening.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah. So I will send you all the link. I will also send you all the link to I'll send you all the recording. I'll send you all the link of the course if you want to take a further look. If you've got any more questions, please email me, and either I or Brenda will give answers. But the course starts on April the 7th, which is a Monday. It's at 2:00 UK time, which would be 3:00 for France or Germany or Hungary. And for the States, it will be 9:00 in the morning. If you're, is that right? Yes, that's right. 9:00 in the morning if you're in Eastern time. If you're in Pacific time, you have to get up at 6 a.m. But which some people do, bless them. But every session is recorded. So, a lot of people follow on behind the scenes, and because they can't make it into the sessions for whatever reason. So you can follow on whether you can join in live or not. But it's always lovely when people can join live. So any more questions? Any more questions about that? Any more comments? Thank you for being a fantastic group. I've really much enjoyed sharing today, and hope to see you again soon. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you. Goodbye for now. Bye-bye.